Hey, thanks, Todd, Chuck, and the rest of the team for giving me this opportunity to share my top tips and tricks to power up your app designs. I will go ahead and start my screen share.
So I'm curious, what is your background since you're showing off design stuff? Do you come from a designer background?
I do not come from a design background. I come from more like a pro code developer background. And so these are stuff that I learned along the way. And I think, and this is what I want to share, because you don't really have to be a UI or UX designer or a professional web designer to be able to amp up your app designs. So I'm hoping these tips will help everyone in their journey of app designing.
Awesome.
Right. Hey, everybody. I live in Dallas, Texas, and I am a collaboration and custom app dev consultant with Artis Consulting. And I'm also a co-founder of the Dallas Fort Worth Power Apps and Power Automate UG. I'm a business applications MVP, and I frequently blog and tweet my learnings and experiences using the tool set. And I am passionate about the Power Platform and an enthusiast of all things Office 365, the Azure Stack, and IoT. Today, I want to. There are actually several tips and tricks that I use while I'm designing apps, but I've kind of squished them into my top 5 tips that I would like to share with everybody today, and it should be easy enough to remember with the acronym POWER. And under each tip, we're going to try and look at 1 or 2 tricks that would help power up your app designs. Now, number 1 tip is to start planning ahead. It is important that you have a sketch or a visualization of how you want your apps to look like, and that can happen right after you have a good understanding of foundational information architecture that you have, or even if once you have a good functional design and you know how the user flow and data flow needs to be. So it is important that you start prototyping before you get started with your actual app building exercise. And there are several tools out there. It could be something as simple as in PowerPoint, or it could be something that you use like a third-party tool like, say, Adobe XD or Lucidchart. There are several products out there that can help you. But PowerPoint is more than enough. That's something that I generally turn towards for my prototyping and sketching. And then another good tip for you, if you're like me and you don't know where to start and you're not a professional web designer, is to get inspired. Look at templates that the Power Apps Maker portal has. There are several app templates like the Customer Success Management app template, the Meetings app. These have some really good UI UX designs that you can look at and you can adapt and extend based on your business processes. And then you also have professional developer-based sites like UI Movement and UX Matters, where you have professional designers who share their top designs with theming, branding, colors, typography, and so much more. And speaking of branding, I know Sancho's on the call today, and that is another great place to get started. He has a branding template, and there's version 2 out there that he put out in the Power Apps forums, where you can download the template, open up the app, how configure the controls how you want it to be, save them, and then it generates an MSAP file that you can use as a template to have a consistent look and feel for all the apps that are built in your organization. Below here, I have a bunch of Power Addicts listed. Alan Chai and Yusuf both have videos out there that talk about the top design principles that you should use. And if you look at their apps, you will realize the art of possible with Power Apps, and they have been my major inspirations in actually building apps that look very close to native mobile apps and web professional web apps. And then we have several other folks there. For example, April has her design framework around branding, theming, and performance that she shared during Ignite last year. And you make sure that you follow them and visit their YouTube spaces, and you be sure to learn more from them. The next tip over here is specific to colors. So once you have your design and you have a user flow of how the navigation needs to work, first thing you really want is to decide on the theming of your apps. I usually tend to stick to 3 colors, but recommendations that you can go anywhere between 1 to 3 primary colors or secondary colors. Now, when we say primary colors, it means you pick one color and then have a light or dark accent, and that way you have a contrast variation. And you also want to make sure that your color variations are accessible, in the sense it's accessible for users that have color disabilities or auditory disabilities and things like that. And the way I usually have my style sheets, and I call them my PSS, the Power App style sheet, I tend to put my colors and accents in a variable on the app start, and that way I can reuse them across all of the controls and screens within the app, and I don't have to, copy paste or start typing in the actual color codes. And one other way to do it is to actually store it in a data source if needed, and that enables consistency. And so all app makers in your organization can look at the data source, or you can have a template app with a screen that has standardized controls and styles, and that can be a starting point for building apps for your users. Before we move on to the next step, I want to quickly show you my
Geetha, while you're clicking over to that, I have a question about the colors here. If you're going to do a night mode, day mode Power App, do you also pick your colors at that point too?
Yes, I do. Yeah, so I do go to certain tools, and that's what I'm going to go show you. And I pick up my color palette and make sure that the contrasts and variations are present for the colors, and then also that make sure that they are visible under bright light and things like that. So here's my go-to tool. Material Design is a go-to processor color tool for mobile apps, and you can see here that you can actually create a palette for you. It generates sampled palettes for you, but then you can pick what your primary color needs to be, or you can even generate a custom palette, and then it generates how the darker and lighter accents would look like for your primary color, and then how your lighter and dark accents would look like for secondary colors. And then you also have options to look at how your text needs to be and how it would look like on your primary colors and on your secondary colors. And the good thing about this is it also generates a preview of how this color combination is going to look like on your apps when when you have charts or you have controls and images dropped in. And then and another thing you want to note here is the accessibility. It does a great job of telling you what color text will be visible on a primary background or a secondary background. So this tells me that using a black color text on this indigo background is not legible. So these go hand in hand with the WCAG compliance. And so this is somewhere that I usually go to get started, because it kind of comes with recommendations around how it has to be accessible, and also gives you a trending palette that you can use. Another site that I go to is Coolers. This is another one of my favorites. This kind of keeps it minimal. It gives you a palette with very minimal colors. Let's say we have a black and a white, and then these are just the three colors that are generated. What I really like about this is that you can view shades if you feel like you don't like some of them, and another good tip here is you can go export it. You can export it into a PDF, and it generates a PDF with all the color variations and the hex codes that you might want to use. And here, if you go to CSS and you actually scroll down to the bottom to the RGB section, what you can do is literally copy paste this into your app start and a set variable, and then just rename the colors depending on how you want to name it, or how usable it might be intuitive for a maker to use it across the app, and then you're good to get started. So that's one. Now, my second tip here is to see how you can use some of the controls. There are several controls available in the Power App Studio Maker portal that you can go above and beyond to create incredible looking apps. Now, one such control that I think is a little underrated and people don't really grasp the benefits of using the control is the HTML control. The HTML control is a very powerful control. You can use that to create CSS 3 properties, and there are some supported properties, there are some that are not. You can create box shadows, you can have gradients, you can even create icons using HTML controls using Unicode characters. And then the only thing to note that it only allows you to have inline styles. You cannot have global styles in the sense you can't have a style tag and have styles in there that would be used by the rest of your app. The control pretty much just allows you to have styles that would control just that specific area or zone that you have the control for. And then it also does not support any animation attributes. And then a pseudo class is not supported as well. For example, pseudo classes are more like special state of elements. For example, if you mouse over, or there's a custom scroll bar that would, that you require to change the color on, those are things that you can do. But there's a lot more that you can do, and you can get creative with it, and you can really amp up your app designs. So let's look at that one. So I'm going to go ahead and show you an app So this is an app that I have. This is a PTO app, and there are several nuggets within this app. And if you notice, this little piece over here is an SVG. SVGs are pretty light on your app, and you want to make sure that you use SVGs wherever possible, places where you want some complex animation or graphics. And you can also plug in your variables and make them dynamic. So in this case, I have some dynamic values popped in for me to see how many days I have approved versus how many days I have in total. And here we have a gallery control, and each template here has an HTML control. Now that little box shadow effect that we have there, and that we're achieving using the HTML control. And here you can see that it's a simple div tag, and I'm specifying how the position needs to be, and I can also have conditional logic between what the color needs to be when it's selected versus when it's not selected. And then this is how the box shadow is really specified. You give it the dimensions of the offsets, and then you also specify how you want the shade for the box shadows to be on each side of the box. And then the rounded edges is how you specify the border radius, and that really drives how sharp or how rounded you want the edges to be. One other thing you notice here is that the background over here is also a simple HTML tag, and if you notice pretty close, there's a little rounded edges on the corner, and that's the border radius that actually drives that. The regular shapes that you can drop don't really, Power Apps doesn't have a way for you to have rounded edges, but HTML can enable you to do that. One other tip over here is the icon. If you have a lot of icons and if you want to make your apps more performant, one good way for you to steer away from actually having images loaded is to use Unicode character icons. So here you can see that this is a right arrow, and let's say I don't want to use the one that's available out of the box, then I can actually drop in an HTML Unicode character, and that usually starts with an ampersand hash and ends with a semicolon. And really this X2192 is the Unicode for the arrow. And you can also specify the font size and colors. And recently, Alan and Rory, they both had tips shared where they use Unicode characters on Power BI, and it was and they have links. And there's a Unicode table out there that you can go and search for a specific style of icon, and it will give you what the character is. So that's one tip that I wanted to share. And one other thing I wanted to show you is that there are actually different types of box shadows. Just a quick tip here. If there are cards and layouts that you want to display, then you don't want to get aggressive with the box shadows. You want to keep them pretty mild. But then if there are buttons and they're clickable, then you can have a much darker box shadow. So it kind of gives you a 3D effect, and it implies that it can be clickable. You can also have gradients set up in your HTML control. So what we have here is a linear gradient going from left to the right, and it has a lighter shade and it gets darker towards the ref. And you can see that this is set by the background property within your HTML control. And now if you don't know HTML and if you're completely new, there are sites out there, and one such site is a cssgenerator.org, and that generates the HTML for you. You can pick what the colors that you want, how the offsets need to be, how your box shadows need to look like, and it will generate the HTML that you can just copy paste and embed it as well. One other tip, a bonus tip that I wanted to show you is, if you ever needed to truncate text within, let's say you have a chunk of text within your gallery control and you want to truncate it, you can do that using HTML control as well. So what we're really doing here is making sure that the text overflow is set to ellipses. And so that's what you see, that it actually has a width set to 450 and it truncated it with an ellipsis. So that's another trick that you can use if you want to truncate text in zones where you want to just show a preview and then take them over to another screen or a form where you want to show them a more enlarged view of the context. So here is our third tip. This is the WCAG compliance that we already looked at, which is the Web Content Access Guidelines. Now we looked at how you want to, when you decide your colors and variations, you want to make sure that they're compliant. But then you also want to make sure that you add labels and tooltips to your forms and inputs, because they're, as designers, we have the responsibility to make sure that everybody has access to what we create, regardless of the ability, context, and situation. So end of the day, we want to make sure it's a better experience for everybody. So So make sure that if you, on the Power Apps app checker, there is an accessibility area that will display all the controls that don't have the accessible label. So that's something you want to make sure that you add them, because people who use screen readers are going to be hearing what those controls are for. So if you don't have an accessible label, and or if it's named something that doesn't provide context, then it's not going to be useful for the users. So make sure you add them. And then here is another example where you do want to make sure that you add some visual cues and not just rely on colors to provide important information. For example, these are required fields for submission, and for a regular user, yes, these would appear red and I know that I'm missing these. But for a user who cannot perceive color as the rest of us do, it is going to look like it's just normal. So you want to make sure that you add some visual cues like an icon, and that, that would tell the user that, oh, there's something wrong, it's a warning icon. And then there's also another theme designer by Office UI Fabric, and that also does a good accessibility check for you, on texts and color variations. And we'll look at that as part of my last demo. So this next tip over here is around effective and engaging UX, and I'm going to cover like two tips that would really enhance your apps. The number one tip is the text overlay, because it's become really popular these days where you see overlay of text labels on background images. But the last thing you want is your users to be straining to read such text. Now, the image on the left over here has text. It has these numbers and it has a date, but then I have an overlay over the actual background image, and you can see that the text really pops out pretty well. But then the one on the left over here, which has white text that has a description about the actual app or context and a button, is visible, but it may not be as visible to every user. And so you want to make sure that you add an overlay to your app, and that's what we call a scrim. It can either be a scrim is a semi-transparent black or white overlay, or you can even have a colored overlay to neutralize the busy background behind. This is just another tip to make your user experience engaging. One other tip is designing fat finger friendly apps. If you haven't heard this term, it is a real syndrome. It's called the fat finger syndrome, and it is when a user inadvertently triggers a secondary action when navigating touchscreen UI, and then you either have a gallery, you have an edit icon and a delete icon, and the icons are either too close or there's not enough padding, and so there's not a separation between your controls or call to action. So here's the recommendation from Material Design UI, and their recommendation is that you have a minimum of 48 pixels with at least an 8-pixel space between your targets. And Matt recently also shared a tweet about how he uses the padding on an icon to cover the text around it, so that way there's a more hit zone and target zone when you are clicking on icons. One quick tip here is that you can use the one thumb, one eyeball test for mobile designs. It's just a way to find out if your mobile design allows for users to easily use the app in one hand with partially distracted attention. And it's a way to test if users can perform certain actions in just one hand and under 60 seconds. My last tip for the day is to reduce complexity. It is important that you remember performance is key and less is more. I like this quote from April from her Ignite session where she says, Marie Kondo your apps, keep the controls that really provide value to your app, and then clean the rest of them out. Use SVGs where there are complex animations involved, and replace your icons and images with HTML Unicodes if you can. Use HTML controls to combine a bunch of controls or data that you would want to display, and also galleries as another workaround if you want to keep your number of controls to be less than 500. And another tip is also when you have forms and you have scrolling forms, people can scroll, but then it makes it easier for them to engage with the app if you have them logically grouped or you have tab layouts or flyout menus. My last tip is also to use components. I know Manuel is going to help us understand how components are helpful and how we can use that to power up our apps, but they really help you with reusability across all apps and also in maintaining consistency with your look and feel. That is all the tips that I had today, and I hope you find them useful. And I hope these are tips that would help you enhance your journey with app designing.